And good morning, everyone. Thanks for your patience. My name is John Fadis. I'm a partner at PKF Mueller and lead our nonprofit group. And happy to be here today with our first webinar in a while. We've done in-person sessions over a quarterly, about every quarter we do these. But today we're going to do a webinar. And it's actually on a topic that we've gotten a lot of questions on from a lot of our nonprofit clients over the past 2 years. And it all relates to this: nonprofits, business considerations when hiring talent and doing business abroad. There's so many issues, complex issues related to this. As we get going here, I'm going to introduce our panelists. But before I do that, and our moderator today, I have to go over a few housekeeping items. First, we're going to answer all the questions at the end of the session. So as you have questions throughout the day, please type them right into the chat. And then Ashley is going to, she's overseeing the computer and is going to read them out to us later. Second, we're going to actually be providing you with the recording and the contact information of all the presenters today. So we'll send that via email after the presentation so you have that for your records. And finally, you can get 1 hour of CPE credit today. If you want to be able to do that, we'll give you that information provided there's an evaluation you have to fill out in a sign-in form. So with all those housekeeping items out of the way, I wish I had Alan Parson project music in the background because we're going to introduce each of the individual presenters and the moderator one at a time. But first, I'd like to have Dave Nissen come on up. Dave, welcome.
Hello, thank you very much.
Good morning. Good morning.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I'm glad you could be here. We haven't presented together in a while, that's for sure.
No, I'm excited.
Yeah, it's going to be nice. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about PKF Mueller for those that aren't familiar with it.
Oh, it'd be great. No, you know, as you know, because you're one of my partners, PKF Mueller is a top 150 firm in the country and 15 in Chicago. So we're really proud of that. And, you know, part of the reason why we've grown so much is our connection to international businesses. And we're in the German American Chamber of Commerce offices here because we really like that. And that's why I think this is so important, because the world is small. The world is real small, and I think it's really hard to get talent these days, as you know. And I think you have a lot of companies are looking all over for that talent.
Absolutely, and they want to make sure they're doing the right tax work and all the other filings that are necessary to have those employees working for their entities. So,
I mean, all we could do as owners is to really kind of know we want to find talent, and now it's up to a lot of experts with the taxes and
that's right,
and entities and all the things, which we'll find out from our panelists.
We have our two esteemed experts that will be joining us shortly, and let's call out the first one. We'll have Rick Hamill come join us now. Rick, good morning.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Good to meet you today.
Wow.
Just had the pleasure of meeting Rick this morning for the first time. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and Atlas as well?
Yeah, so Rick Hamill, founder and CEO of Atlas. My background is really in HR. I actually started off in government contracting, supporting companies on the PROS 5 contract in Saudi Arabia, Singapore, and Japan. And I created this organization based on my own experience of trying to find talent and spin up talent in foreign countries and the headache of trying to figure it out. And so, you know, complexity and compliance are the things I think about when you think about global talent. And so we created a way that we can simplify global expansion, simplify through compliance, the way to hire talent by finding the best talent, and not just in your postal code, but, you know, over the billions around the world. So my goal here is to talk to everyone, make sure we educate people on the employer of record model, but also show that expanding globally is not just for the big boys anymore. Everyone can expand. This is the way to do it.
Great. Thank you. That's good. Thank you. And last but not least, we'll enter our last panelist, Amy Shimon, another partner with PKF.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Nice to see
Hello.
you. Good morning.
Pleasure.
Good to see you again, Rick.
And Amy, would
Happy that you're joining us today.
It's my
Yeah.
pleasure. Thank you.
Would you mind sharing a little background about yourself? For the viewers?
I'm Amy Shamoon, and I am an international services partner with PKF Mueller. I work with a lot of small to medium-sized businesses and helping them solve solutions expanding abroad, and working with people like you, Rick, so we can help our clients accomplish the things that they want to as they're expanding abroad, hopefully save them some money and make it a smooth transition for them.
Thanks, Amy. Well, that's the introductions of everybody. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass the gavel over to Dave, and he's going to kind of be the moderator today for the questions throughout the session.
Well, thanks, John. I think what we're going to do too, I got a bunch of questions here, and I'm going to start asking the questions. I think during that, we might have some more that'll just funnel in that comes to the top of our heads. So with that being said, the first one's going to be to you, Rick.
Okay.
And if we could ask that, and what are some of the common pitfalls or challenges you see nonprofits face when they try to expand globally?
Yeah, I think great question. And it's a question that we have to think about quite often is, one is where to expand, and what makes sense for the organization. Two is budgets. Nonprofits, although they may have grants and they may have resources behind that, they have to be accountable for where they're spending money and how they're investing around the world. And so what's going to be most cost effective? How are they going to get the most bang for the buck? And how fast can they do it? That's really important. And then the third thing I would say is compliance. Because they are working through grants, meaning in many cases are government subsidiaries, they are very focused on making sure they're doing it the right way. So compliance is a big component of that. And although when we have conversations with a lot of our nonprofits, our NGOs, we're finding that in some cases they've maybe gone on Google, they've maybe got some information from someone else that's done something a certain way. It's not always been the right way. And so making sure compliance is always number one, speed is number two, cost effective tends to be number three, and the overall experience that they have when they're finding talent, that's really important as well.
Google's not always right.
Well, if it's on the internet, it must be right. But
don't believe everything
you
see.
Just curious, what's the worst company to try to get into it?
Which country?
Which is the easiest and which is the hardest?
Well, I think that every country has its complexity. I think
they're all unique.
They're all unique from that perspective. But I will say that it's because they're unique. It's not just the same way. I think we're born not born. We're taught how to do business in the countries that we're headquartered in. And so many times I'm having conversations with U.S. nonprofits where they're saying, well, what do you mean there's an employment agreement? What do you mean I have to give notice? We're very used to, as Americans, focusing on at-will employment.
Yes.
But at-will employment is just a U.S. process. And so understanding, hey, if you're going to hire someone, for example, in Switzerland, there's going to be a 90-day notice of termination for that. Pensions are not always a request. It's sometimes mandatory. Healthcare is very different than how it's managed in many countries. And so it's not just setting up an entity and going to those particular countries or hiring talent. It's really understanding the complexities behind that and then navigating behind it. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes costs that comes to managing employees, not necessarily doing it just from what you see on Google.
Yeah. One thing as I practiced accounting over my career in tax, I've always told folks on a tax standpoint, how do they want to say it? Don't let the tax tail wag the dog.
Very true.
Okay. And I think the same thing could be said here too, right? If you kind of always have to see what's best for the organization, not this is a country I want to go to because of these things. You need to know what they are, but you don't go there just because of these favorable treatments. There's still the purpose of being to that country is more important than all the technical things. Would you agree with that?
I agree. I think that when you listen to companies and their strategy, sometimes they just say, I want to go in this country and that's the direction I'm going to go. But you have to think about what type of employer you want to be. What does that also mean from a tax structure? Well, how's that going to impact the organization as a whole? What is PE risk I'm going to have if I hire an employee? Do I want to outsource that to a third party like an employer of record? Do I want to test a market? I like to use the example of China quite often. China takes 18 months and $250,000 to actually set up an entity. Now, let me be clear. That is setting up the entity. That's not actually doing everything you need to do to actually register for employees and all the tax registrations and all the province registrations that you have to do in those particular countries. So you have to really come up with a plan and make sure that you're partnering with an organization like yourselves or in partner with an employer of record where we can talk through and kind of walk through the mitigation risk. Sometimes it's not just hiring the employee, it's also if you're going to have clients, if you're going to generate revenue, what that's going to look like as well. And you have to have a plan. You don't just want to walk into registrations or set up and go into a particular market without actually knowing what you're doing.
Well, it's going to segue right into my question number 2, Rick. Okay. What is an employer of record?
Great question.
You brought that up a couple of times. I just would like to know it. I hear it, I'm intrigued.
Yeah, so an employer of record is, in essence, where a company wants to hire talent in a foreign country where they actually don't have a legal entity. And what that means is, using that example for China, 18 months, $250,000, You're looking to expand your business. You're looking to get talent into a particular country. You're looking to support grants that you're being awarded from the government. You are able to do that a lot faster by using an employer of record. In essence, we would hire that employee underneath our entity. Even while you're doing the registration for your own entity, we will be able to provide benefits, pensions, tax payments. We are responsible for all the back-end component of that, where the client's responsible, we call them the managing employer, the day-to-day of the actual business. So
really lets them focus on their day-to-day operations rather than worrying about the employees and making sure they're in compliance with everything, including benefits.
So here's my sales pitch on that. I say, focus on what you do best and let us do the rest, right? The back end of what that has to look like is, when you register, when you're going into a particular country, taxes, pensions, those are things that are not only just important to making sure you're fully compliant, but employees also want to make sure that whatever employer they're working with, they're doing it the right way. Pensions, taxes, that affects their livelihood, affects their families. So how do we make sure that we support that? That's where we come in and really make sure that you're focused on growing your business, the strategic direction of your business, or we're just really the back-end support from a legal perspective.
I know you're asking all the questions, but if I may, in addition to just the EOR, there's the other term that we always hear, a PEO, where they're used interchangeably, and I think people have a difficult time distinguishing between the two. So it might be beneficial for others to hear the main differences between the use of a PEO and the use of PEO.
So I'm very passionate about this. I also know the PEO industry very well. And PEOs are great. They really are, but it's really a U.S. term. It's in IRS documentation. It's also legislated on the state level as well. But it's really a U.S. term. And what that means is where two legal employers, are employing one employee in a given state. Now, what's great about that is here in the U.S., you can be competitive. You can go after workers' compensation. You can do benefits. It really helps you scale, but there's still liability that is shared from both employers. And PEO only takes on the tax liability to a certain extent. Actually, if the PEO in the U.S. doesn't pay the taxes, the client is still responsible for that in some cases in many parts of the states. Where an EOR is very different. The EOR assumes all liability because the client doesn't have a legal entity in that country. So we are the actual employer in the eyes of the government. Now, PEO, again, the definition of two employers employing one employee, in many countries is actually illegal. Because the countries want to say, they want to know who is ultimately responsible, if it's for Social Security, if it's pensions, who is the ultimate responsible party, and you can't have shared liability from that perspective. So from our perspective, when we work with clients, we say, if you have a legal entity in that country where you employ employees, we will not work with you because that is illegal. We're very big about compliance. And because we're a direct employer of record, meaning we do not outsource to third parties, we are fully responsible and have a vested interest to make sure it's done correctly. So EOR is where the client has no legal entity, where we're employing the employees on their behalf. PEO, again, very U.S. term, is where both companies have an entity and there's shared liability with the employee. You're just coming together for insurances or workers' compensation coverage.
So just to expand, actually, you answered my third question already, which was, what are the advantages of setting up a EOR, which I've learned now is employer of record, versus setting up a new legal entity, and it saves a lot of costs.
Yeah.
That's the main thing. But I want to go back to the PEO and the EOR. So you're saying, and it's unlikely a PEO in most cases will not pay their bills. I mean, there's a lot of good ones out there. Right. But you're saying, technically, if they are not liable for the taxes in a country if it's an EOR.
That's correct. So the EOR.
Period. It's bottom line 100% accurate.
That is correct, because the client doesn't have a legal entity. So the contract that's signed with the employee, the registration that's done in the Social Security government as well, is done through our entity in that particular country. So we're fully liable. Now, our contracts indicate if the client doesn't pay us, then there's some liability behind that. Don't get me wrong. Yeah, right. But from a legislative perspective, we are actually fully liable 100% for making sure tax payments go out, that makes sure that pensions are paid and funded, and we're also responsible for any compliance requirements, if it's healthcare, if it's dental, if it's life insurance. In some cases, actually, some countries are now mandating life insurance by employers. We're responsible for that, those liabilities.
Okay, good.
So you're responsible for that, but there could be some complexities with that, and such as PE, that could come into play here, and your contracts are are well designed, and you work with your clients to make sure that you're kind of preventing some of that, especially if they're not wanting to create a taxable presence in the country beyond and really utilizing and benefiting from the EOR.
Yeah, so I'll dive in a little bit about that. So we are the first ones to be 100% direct. And I remember when I started this model, everyone in our industry was like, why would you go direct? No one's doing that. Everyone outsources. Well, I was a client of a former, what they called at the time, global PEO, which is why we changed the term to employer of record. And I said, look, my employees, there was complexity because when you outsource to third parties who may also outsource to fourth parties, it creates a lot of complexity behind that. So we built our model knowing that we wanted to be direct. So we partnered with organizations like yourself, with lawyers around the world to make sure we understood how do we make sure we mitigate that PE risk through our contract. How do we make sure that the client, many clients, especially when it comes to culture that they want to build within the organizations, they want their name, they want their logo, they want all of them in the contract. And then we have to remind them that, well, if your name is on the contract, if you're a third party to the contract, you then create PE risk from that perspective. So a lot of the, hey, we understand a cultural nuance, maybe you want to create an offer letter that says this is not a contract, but just to provide that experienced employee, maybe you can do that. But when it comes to the legal documentation that an employee signs, it's got to have our name on it because we are shielding our clients from that PE risk based on our own experience.
That's good. Hey, I want to get to the next question, but I want to be sure, Mr. Leader, I don't know if you said this when you did your introduction, but you've been really almost your whole career focusing on nonprofits.
Correct.
And you are our number one leader in that, nonprofit of partner for PKF Mueller. So this next question could be for you too. Just
Very
want to
good.
bring that up. You're into this conversation.
Happy to be so.
So how can a nonprofit, for all of us, how can a nonprofit minimize the business or the tax risk and cost when entering into a new market?
Well, there's a couple things that I think we can think about. One is, again, getting back to strategy.
Yeah.
Understanding how they're going to go after business, partnering with organizations like yourself, and really understanding the mitigation of risk. I think that's important. What are they going to be doing? How are they going to be billing? Are they going to have clients in that country? Is this more of just a hiring for a service center? There's a lot of that they have to think about from that perspective. So mitigation, and definitely speaking to their accountants, I think is number one in my opinion.
That comes up a lot of times where some of the nonprofits may want to have a conference in that foreign country.
Oh, yeah.
And when they, depending how they plan for it, well or bad, could cause a lot of issues for them. I've seen that after the fact. They said, oh, John, we wish we would have had talked to you or somebody ahead of time before doing all the work related to that conference. So that's just one example.
Well, I think you bring up a good point. I want you to add your thing here, but when you're saying that, I hear that a lot. It's called proactivity, right?
Absolutely.
But a lot of times, this is why we do these webinars, and what you've done a great job with these quarterly series is educating our nonprofit community in these types of things, so it doesn't come, oh, I wish I would have known about that before I held the conference, right?
Absolutely. And I'm more an expert on the audit side.
Of course.
So I know Amy, we have others, Eleanor Livingston, one of our tax leaders at PKF Mueller and others, they're the ones that are more equipped to discuss the key tax issues in addition to the employee issues as well. So you get a whole slew of different issues related to doing the operations there. And then if you're going to set people up there, it's all the things that Rick's been talking about already.
Amy, you wanted to hear?
Yeah, I was just going to add that, people like to move fast. They got a grand business idea. They want to expand. I was like, it's time. I can see so many more advantages and benefits if we start operating in, I'll pick Germany, for example. We do a lot of work with German clients. So they move so fast, they forget to talk to people like PKF Mueller, accounting firms. They forget to speak to the lawyers. They forget to speak to someone like Atlas, and they'll start going over there and they do these activities, and slowly they find out that they're doing some things that they shouldn't be doing, and now they've got to do a lot of fixing. They got to clean up everything. So advanced planning, that is a tip that every business organization should be looking at.
Yeah.
We're really talking to all the key players, as well as even talking to their other not-for-profits in those jurisdictions to talk about their experiences, even if you can find the ones that do something similar to their mission.
I think you just hit it on the head, which is, what's your short-term plan? What's your long-term plan? And it's okay to have two plans. It's okay to go down two paths, but what does that look like? And your short-term plan may be, okay, what did I find on the internet and how can I get it done because I need to get it done next week? And the long term is making sure that you're speaking to your consultants. But I think it's doing your research, having the right conversations, looking into your own network, which is really important as well. What are other people doing? And then making sure that you look at different scenarios. If it's establishment, if it's setting up an employer of record model, what's going to work best for your organization in the short term and in the long term. And it's okay to have two plans.
Yeah, that's good. So now we're going to get into this really good question because it's kind of probably the number one reason why we're having this webinar today, and that's about talent. And we talked about we've talked about this at our partner retreat the last couple of days. Talent shortage is going to be with us probably forever, in my opinion. I don't know if you share the same opinion. Even in a downturn, talent is hard to find. It's going to continue to be hard to find. So now, do we have any tips or advice for nonprofits as they hire talent and expand internationally?
Yeah, I think the one question that comes up quite often is, it's okay to find talent anywhere and everywhere. Right now, we live in a world that we're working remotely. We're not the same, organizations we were prior to COVID. Organizations have changed. The expectation for employees have also changed. I've seen with many of our clients, people who would have never applied for certain positions in certain locations are now applying for that because they said, well, it's remote. I can work anywhere. It doesn't matter if you're headquartered in Chicago and I'm sitting in Brazil. As long as I can do the job, why can't I do that? I'm in the time zone. I can support you guys from that perspective. So being open-minded is going to be really important. But that's the first step. The second step is understanding what it means to do business in that particular country. I actually had a call with a nonprofit the other day, and they talked about, and it was very funny when they said this, because I'm very methodical and very passionate about these things. They came to me and said, we have an employee that we pay out of the U.S., but they live in the Philippines. And the first question I asked them, I said, well, does that person that's in the Philippines have the legal right to work in the U.S.? No. So, okay, are you doing any withholdings on that place? I said, no. I said, are you doing any with any holdings in the Philippines? They said, no. I said, well, that's not an employee. That sounds like a contractor.
Right.
So understanding what it means to actually employ somebody, because you also have to be careful, especially from an audit perspective. When you say to an auditor, especially on the employment side, this is an employee, and you then say, okay, well, show me the tax records behind it, that you've made the contributions, that you're fully compliant from that perspective, and then you don't have that, then you run into more complexity and non-compliance. So really understanding how to do business, understand the complexity of that, and then understanding what your expectations are, because an employee experience, and this is something that we don't talk about a lot from an accounting or from a business perspective, is what's the employee experience going to be like?
That's important.
How do you, I tell people all the time, think about if someone came to you and said, okay, we're going to hire you, but you don't have to complete a W-9 or W-4. You don't have to fill out your tax forms. Oh, and by the way, you're not going to get a W-2 at the end of the year, but we're still compliant. How would you feel about that? You would feel a little sketchy, right?
Yeah. Sure.
And so what is that experience when a nonprofit is looking to go abroad? Employees have minimum expectations of what has to be delivered.
Even though all those employees don't know how to fill out the W-4.
Well, it won't be a W-4.
I'm only bringing it up because
it changed last.
Nobody knows how to fill it out. Whenever my kids get a new job, they say, Dad, can you help me fill out this W-4? Like,
well, that's a whole nother conversation.
These are 30-year-old kids, too. These are 30-year-old kids.
Right.
Page 2.
I just fill it out for them, to be honest with you.
But I think that it's the experience that you're thinking about from the employee.
Right?
And so the employee says, okay, I'm going to take this chance to work with this organization that may not have an entity in that given country, and I'm going to support them in their mission, because, by the way, nonprofits, it's really about the mission, right?
It really
so people are very passionate about the overall mission and how they're supporting that, but they're still their livelihood, right? It's how it's going to affect them. So I'm going to take this chance to work with them. I like their mission, but all of a sudden during the onboarding process, there's a lot of red flags. Studies show that after 2 pay cycles, if you get it wrong, you're going to lose that employee very quickly. 2 cycles. Okay? The second thing is that there's a study done by Forbes recently that said 67% of people or talent no longer care just about the paycheck. It's about the additional benefits. benefits for employees right now, especially post-COVID, is extremely important because everyone's now thinking about their health. So as a nonprofit that's looking to hire talent around the world, it's not just I'm going to give them a paycheck. It's making sure that their taxes are paid and et cetera, and also making sure that they have the right proper benefits to make sure they can take care of their families. So being competitive in the marketplace is also really important, which is where the employer of record model comes in too, because we're a lot larger in these countries. So you're trying to find the best talent with mediocre benefits. That's not going to happen.
No, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So you've got to be able to take a step back and say, okay, what's my strategy? How am I going to have those conversations? Who do I need to ask? And how do I put a plan together so that I can build on that? And I think that's where nonprofits really need to think about overall.
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay,
But the talent pool these days seems to be shrinking, right? So people are very desperate. So an ERO framework really does, it helps companies leverage to get that talent globally.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. I'm just as a sidebar with PKF Mueller, the CEO. We've been at PKF Mueller for my whole career. And back in the old, and I say this to all of our employees, I communicate it. You have to communicate things too. Of the benefits we have today are so different than they were 40 years ago. Like, they weren't that great 40 years ago, but now they are. They have to be. They have to be in the U.S. and you're saying in other countries, which is really a critical point.
Yeah, I think with employers, it is an employee pool these days. Employees it's the pendulum, right?
Yeah.
Right now, employees are the ones that are in charge. We're looking for talent, and if they attract that talent, we've got to be competitive.
Yeah.
And so absolutely, benefits are important. It's not just a U.S. thing. You would believe that even with social insurance, which does go through the government, and some countries have amazing programs,
Yeah.
employees are still saying, what do I get on top of that?
Yeah.
Because after COVID, it shocked the world, it shocked the systems. And now employees say, I need to be able to make sure that if something like this happens again, I need to be protected.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Good point. So Amy, I'm going to ask my first one directly to you. Again, you could all chime in if you can. What are the various means of entry a charitable organization should consider when thinking about furthering their mission in a foreign country?
You know, that's a really good question because I get that question all the time with businesses wanting to start expanding abroad. And you've even mentioned a couple of it as we're talking around here, where a company is sending over an employee or sending over a contractor to a particular jurisdiction, and it's a direct employee. I'll just use the U.S. Not-for-profit, and they decide they want to expand over into Germany, but they send one of their own employees over into Germany. And even though they may be doing limited activities, because that's an employer of the legal entity in the U.S., could be creating a branch type operations over there in Germany. That's one form that some companies do. And usually that's because they haven't done some of the advanced planning, and then they get over there and they start doing too much activity. So the other thing is considering whether or not, and I'm not going to go in any order, is setting up a legal entity. A lot of German companies, when they're coming to the U.S., they want to set up a legal entity. And for various reasons, and it's a matter of them just not knowing or understanding what an ERO really does and can provide for them versus what a PEO can do. So the third one is using like an EOR or a PEO, if that made sense. But to me, I think that EOR makes the most amount of sense because it takes a lot of that liability, a lot of that time out of their hands so they can focus on that day-to-day operations and growing their business here in the U.S. And another way is developing relationships with affiliates and other related companies providing similar missions, just joining up with them in the jurisdiction that you want to go to, grow that relationship, and then eventually it might turn into something else.
I would just add that's the number one question nonprofits ask, is that one that Amy just answered. That's the one that, and a half time I wish they would ask it before they already went in and did stuff in those countries.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Well, and I think that's, you say you're just an audit person, but the fact is you're talking to the executive director.
Oh, absolutely.
You're talking to the board. And so you kind of hear everything what they hear sometimes after it happens. So these are very critical to be able to proactively help those executive directors.
And I understand tax as well, but not this.
Yeah, we all kind of do if you know what I'm talking about. Got to know tax, right?
Absolutely.
I think education is important behind that. I think what you just said is sometimes you don't know. Employer of records, it's relatively new. It's been around for about 10, 12 years. And it's really trying to understand what it means. typically, and also culturally, you have to think about as well, Europe is a very conservative market. And you are taught that you're going to expand, you need to set up an entity. That's what you're taught. And so I like to use the example of Uber quite often, is that Uber didn't really change anything. You still got picked up, you still got dropped off, you still paid a fare. What they did, they simplified it. What the employer of record model does is exactly that. You still have to find the talent, you still have to hire the talent, so you make sure you treat them right, you still make sure that they can be compliant with the law. But we've given you an opportunity through our platform and our solution that you are able to hire those employees anywhere in the world through a platform in a matter of days. That's the difference. We just simplified it. And that's exactly what we have to make sure we're educating our clients on and giving them options. Remember, go on Google, you're going to get so much, right? But a lot of it's going to be brick and mortar because that's what's been solidified in our mindset of how to do business. I think it's important, it's our responsibility as change leaders in the world is how do we make sure that people understand their options? Because not every, EOR doesn't fit for everybody. But what it does is it gives an option to figure out how you're going to expand your business.
Mm-hmm. Another question, Amy. Is your mission considered charitable in other countries similar to exempt activities in the U.S.?
I think that's a really good question, especially with various not-for-profits that I've spoken with at our firm. In the U.S., a lot of U.S. not-for-profit charities do assume that their activities in a foreign country would be exempt in that foreign jurisdiction. So that's a little bit of a faux pas because you really need to look into the local law in that country to see if it is. For example, in China, it's very limited and very restricted on the charitable type of activities that you can do. In the U.S., it's pretty much you can almost design anything and apply for exempt status as long as that's what your mission is and you're staying in that mission. So explaining this to our U.S. not-for-profits that are even doing activities abroad or even looking to do activities, it's very important that they do that advanced planning again, because it's just one of those areas they need to be very mindful for.
Mm-hmm.
Ask questions. Always ask questions.
Yes.
Always ask questions.
Here's I like this question. This is probably my favorite. Are you legally allowed to have a physical presence in a country? And the reason why I like that question, because it's really, really complicated, the answer. So I'd like to see how we can answer this one and try to keep at a high level.
I think Rick can answer it in a very simplistic term, and I'll try to keep all of my tax details behind the scenes out of that, because I know it can get a little burdensome. So I will keep it high level. The answer is allowed to have a physical presence in a country, yes, but when you go into that country, how are you going into that country is very important. So just to go over into a country and decide to work there, no, you're not allowed to have that type of physical presence over there in that country. So
you're not, right?
You're not to go over and start working over there. So that's a lot of issues whenever that occurs, and that happens quite often.
Yeah, I've heard.
You have to explain it.
And I've heard 183 days, and there's something like that too, like.
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than just 183 days, like reading on Google, Oh, well, I was only there for 180 days, but what were you doing for 180 days? And who are you working with? Because you could be taxable from day one, depending on the type of activities that you're doing over there. And that 183-day rule does not apply. So
it's really complicated.
Yeah.
It's really complicated. Did you want to add something on that?
Exactly that. I would say a good way to look at that is also look at the visa rules. Yeah. So when you're traveling in a business visa is very restricted, what you can do. Maybe you can go to a client meeting, maybe you can take a client out to dinner, but can you actually physically work at a desk and actually produce something? You got to look at it. And by the way, every country is very different. Yeah. So I always start with, if you're looking at an individual going into that particular country, even if it's for a certain amount of time, what is the difference between a work permit and a business travel visa? And business travel visa for Europe would be an ESTA when they come to the U.S., or if you have to look at our restrictions when we go into Europe as well. But you can actually go on the Department of Labor's website. You can actually look at that online. That's something you can actually look online as long as it's a government website. They will be able to indicate that for you very clearly.
In relation to the visas, us being in public accounting, we're not allowed to practice law or really apply. I mean, we can do visas, but it's not our area of expertise. And I know Atlas internally has a group of attorneys that specialize in this area.
Yep. So we have Visa Mobility, and we actually support clients both for the employer of record, where we'll actually sponsor the visas on behalf of our clients. So when the client doesn't have a legal entity, it needs to be sponsored and actually hire talent in those particular countries. Even if it's for mission work, or it's, we do a lot of USAID work as well, supporting NGOs. We can support the sponsorship of that. If the client has an entity or needs to have them due to their government contract or their other nonprofit requirements, we'll also help navigate that and help them make sure they're established in that registration as well. But Visa it's the one thing that most people get caught up for. And the one thing that you have to think about as well is, just like the U.S. is, it's a tax everywhere. No matter, it's a worldwide income. So how does that impact you? When employees go to another country like Spain, which is also a worldwide income country as well, what takes benefit? Where are you paying taxes? And so looking at things like shadow payrolls, looking at how to blend those out, or dual payrolls, those are things that we can support as well, because sometimes when you're having someone go from the U.S. into a country like Spain, for example, you may want to split their income, you may want to do a dual payroll, you may want to look at how you're registering for that. But again, it's on a client by client level, job position level, and actually, again, speaking to you guys, speaking to us, how we can support that, because it's important that you don't make that mistake. Yeah. Because ultimately, what we talked about earlier, that employee experience, you never want an employee at the end of the year say, hey, I got double tax, and I don't want any tax liability in any country with me.
You don't want to be worse off than what you were before you left. So
great.
A couple technical terms that I know I throw out there is tax equalization, a hypothetical calculation. So that way you can evenly balance that out and make sure you're paying the taxes in the right jurisdictions and getting the credits that you need in the right jurisdiction.
I'm just going to throw a plug in for PKF here a little bit. Because of our international network of PKF, we actually have firms in, I think it's over 150 countries. We have like 230 offices around the world, and we really work well with all these PKF firms. So when we do have we have those entities that are going to China or Spain or Italy or Germany, we have colleagues we can call and kind of talk to about some of these things, which is also important.
One thing we have to, with PKF, you guys, one thing that's really important as well is that even if someone's in an employer of record model, but their home country, the client's actually paying part of their payroll as well, you would want to partner with your employer of record to support that, because the employer of record will be responsible for the country that the employee is employed, if it's a visa sponsorship, for example. But you also want to make sure that you're asking that question and looping in your accountants on both sides to make sure that it's equalized correctly. So that's really important. Just because you have an employer of record that's supporting a sponsor of visa, if you're going to do a tax equalization, or we like to call a shadow payroll, you still need to make sure that there's some symmetry from that perspective. You need to make sure everyone's looped in.
And it's always very important that you're speaking with everybody that's involved
Great.
on these local assignments.
Because if you don't, what ends up happening is they're going to take their process, and you're going to take your process. And if you don't do that, that creates, again, not the best in place thing.
Next, go ahead.
I was going to ask Ashley, we have about 15 minutes left. Have there been many questions yet?
No, we don't have any questions.
No questions. Okay. I was just wanting to make sure we had time in the end.
Oh, so. Good. Okay, next question I like also, because you need people, but you also need money. Money kind of drives everything, doesn't it? You have to have the money to pay people. So a question that I have, again, I'll throw it to you to start, and we could all join in. Can you transfer funds outside of the foreign country back to the United States?
Well, there's a lot of different ways I could go with that.
You're not going to tell us Bitcoin now, right?
And then you're right. But there's a couple different ways you can go with that, because it's, and you can speak to the EOR side, but if you're setting up a legal entity in a foreign jurisdiction and you set up a bank account over there, you start accumulating these funds over there, or just simply getting payments from a foreign donee, and they want to send that over to the U.S. charity, there could be restrictions on the amount of funds that's being transferred, because some countries have restrictions on foreign currency, being able to transfer money from foreign accounts into the U.S. Also, you need to be careful on which country that you're receiving funds or even sending funds to, because the U.S. has certain organizations that sanction the transfer of funds from certain countries that the U.S. does not want us doing business with.
Yeah, OFAC, and
Yeah.
it's really important to understand that. I think on the EOR side of that, it's not really restricted from us. We are restricted because we are a U.S. owned company, so we have to follow the sanction requirements throughout OFAC, but it's pretty open from that perspective. I think.
What was that word you're using? What was this?
OFAC. Yeah.
OFAC?
Yeah.
Okay, what's that?
The government agency that manages sanctions.
Okay.
Around the world. Yeah.
Office of Foreign Asset Control.
Okay. You're throwing out these terms. I'm the CEO. You know?
But to add on top of the ERO, what I was thinking about is if using the EOR, it kind of takes that out if they don't have a legal entity there, because they don't really have that going on right there. So
typically,
it's much easier.
Yeah. So with an employee of record model, our clients are funding from a U.S. perspective, they're funding our U.S. account. If it's in Europe, they're funding our European accounts, and then we're the ones that are responsible for that. Amy, I did have a question for you regarding that. So how does that apply where a client has a transfer pricing policy in place? So how does that help them with any type of money movement?
When they have entities and stuff in place, well, it does have to be at a fair amount, right? So transfer pricing comes in a lot in these situations. But if you're in a country and there's a certain process in that country where you have to fill out an application or submit some documents, and it actually goes to the authorities to get reviewed and approved before you can even transfer the funds over, they will be looking at transfer pricing to make, and should they be taxing that payment? Is it a technical service type fee that it could potentially fall under? And that country may have a 10%, 15, or 20% withholding on that payment before it can be submitted over into the U.S. So,
and you guys support transfer pricing implementation?
Yes.
All right, great. We highly recommend our clients that are looking at that. We do work with clients who have entities in multiple locations, and we separate that. So like maybe we work with North America, then we'll work with their European, then we'll work with their Asian, and they work with our offices in those locations. But transfer pricing does something that that's come up quite often, and something we want to make sure that they understand that they need to look at as well.
And it's coming up a lot more because the IRS is actually looking to focus on mid-sized businesses. Whereas before, transfer pricing was really handled by those really large multinational corporations, while the IRS is like, you know what, there's probably a lot going on in the mid-tier. We need to start looking at them. So we're going to see a lot more of that.
I think transfer pricing, just one more thing about that, is a lot of people hear it and they go, oh, that's a cost. And sometimes they could be expensive, transfer pricing studies. However, I'm going to go into proactivity. I think transfer pricing can pay for itself because number one is it keeps the organization in compliance, which is important. But number two, a transfer pricing study will allow you to show how you could transfer pricing between countries in an acceptable manner to the best possible way to show lower global taxes.
Well, there's this
I hope
range.
I said that okay.
You did. There is a range in transfer pricing, and usually there's a low end,
yes,
what you charge, and a high end of what you charge. And each country has to be looked at individually, but then you got to look at it as a group as well. So you could look into things, and if there's changes in the environment, in the economy, and things like that, you've got some room with comparables in your ranges, because maybe you need to utilize some of the NOLs in a country. So you should always revisit your pricing strategies from a global perspective on
and yet we are so much pushback from foreign countries to utilize that to a global tax planning tool.
It's very challenging at times to get people to collaborate, and especially if they're in more than two countries.
We're not going to give up, though, right?
Never.
We know our
change
challenge
happens if you give up.
That's right. Okay, next question. And again, this is important stuff. I always thought nonprofit means you don't have to pay taxes.
No.
Right? I'm just throwing it out to you. Like, I remember, I'm just CEO.
Must have got on the internet, huh?
Yeah, on Google. But no, you always think that nonprofit means no taxes. However, there's a lot of taxes, and I just had an experience the other day that made me realize nonprofits do pay tax. So, Amy, another question. For U.S. charitable organizations considering business abroad, what are some of the important tax compliance matters that should be reviewed?
Now, this is another area that gets really, really complicated.
Yeah.
So using Atlas as an EOR, it simplifies a lot of that, especially if you can keep from a permanent establishment taxable presence while you're using the EOR and you're growing. So you don't have to worry about that jurisdiction's filings, VAT, income tax, the myriad of different taxes that another country can have. In the U.S., even if you don't have a legal entity in a foreign jurisdiction, you're creating a presence through a branch because of your activities that you're doing over there. And it's not just physical presence these days. Now there's economic presence standards as well. In the U.S., you've got a lot of foreign reporting forms, and I'm not going to start rattling those off right now, but it's very important to make sure that if you do have a permanent establishment in any kind of way or branch operations in a foreign jurisdiction, that you're doing all the reporting over there you need to do from a compliance standpoint, plus everything in the U.S., because the civil penalty assessments for these informational type forms that may on some occasions now because of the 2017 Tax Reform Act, pull some of those earnings in from the foreign jurisdiction as tax. But the penalties are $10,000 per form per year. One in particular form related to transfer pricing identification for the IRS is 5472 for related party transactions. That jumped up from a $10,000 penalty to a $25,000 penalty. And I'm not saying this to scare any of our not-for-profits. I'm just saying advanced planning will take care of all of this to help mitigate any of those risks you could be facing as you're expanding abroad.
And those forms, what we're seeing, the IRS do flag those.
They send out matching notices.
Yeah,
So when you're filing returns now, if you filed 45472s and it was filed late, you're going to get slapped with a $100,000 penalty. And if it's not your first time doing that, it's very unlikely you're going to get out of it.
If it's first time, you might get out of it, but
Maybe.
the second you're saying, yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
But you're never safe, John. I mean, I always thought these 5472s were only for for-profits. Now I'm hearing it's all over the place for nonprofits.
Yeah, there's so many forms now. That's why we get the specialists involved. It's kind of, I would say 20 years ago, maybe about 5% of the nonprofits would be doing stuff globally. Now it's probably up to 25% and more doing it globally. The larger organizations are going to be a lot more overseas and want to do things that they have chapters or affiliates in those locations. It's been an amazing growth, as you said at the beginning. It's a global world, and that's how it is now. And it's just going to get more and more. Because these will impact more and more nonprofits in years to come. There's no doubt.
My heart really goes out to a lot of clients when we find out that they've gotten themselves in a compliance situation and these notices start coming in and they feel like they've been violated. They haven't done anything wrong, and it's just because they just didn't know. We do everything that we can to get them out of that.
Education.
Actually did say that we have one question, so
Great.
if you wouldn't mind reading it would be good to get some audience feedback here.
Of course, someone is asking about experience working with the new NGO law in China.
I have not had any direct experience with that in China.
So I can tell you that we do partner with a number of NGOs who do expand into China, but we have a different exemption for that because we are employer of record, so we're not an NGO from that perspective, but they have used us actually more recently. I can say we've closed maybe 4 clients recently, given the new restrictions that have come out and what they're looking to get around with us. So the employer of record has allowed us to support that process.
And I think one thing I'll just say is we have a PKF Mueller has a really good China-U.S. desk right now. And we've got a lot of Chinese-speaking professionals on our team. And I would say whoever asked that question should maybe send us your email address, and we could have someone get back to them.
Yeah, that's perfect, because those are the type of questions where you have more questions before you can get to a good explanation, and we've got the resources to connect them on that.
Oh yeah, one of the beauties is one of the firms that I've networked in the UK, they work a ton with the European Commission on Non-Governmental Organizations. If I we got more follow-up as well, I'm sure I could talk to that gentleman who's with one of our PKF firms that we work with and do work with, and definitely be able to help move that person in the right direction.
We do have one more question that just came in.
Oh, good.
How can a nonprofit hire workers from abroad to work in the U.S.?
I can answer that one. Depending on where, if the nonprofit has an entity in the U.S., they're going to have to look at, there's some exemptions that come with the lottery that comes up. I think it's the H-1B1. There's some exemptions from that. They're not actually tied to the lottery numbers. You can apply for as a nonprofit, but that is a process that goes out once a year. So they would want to look at that process. Another way is, depending on certain countries, you can get around the H-1B process. So, for example, Australia, there's an E3. There's J1, depending if they're actually doing work with another one of their entities, you can transfer them in for a certain period of time. But again, looking at mobility, you're going to have to look at country, nationality of the employee, what they're going to be doing here in the period that you want them here. And in some cases, when they're on a certain type of visa, you can apply for green card status as well, but it really depends on how long they're going to be in the country and what their roles are. But I'm happy to take that call. So if anyone has any questions regarding that, our mobility team can look at that for you. But it really, it's a loaded question because it depends on country of origin, nationality of the individual, and then also what they're looking to do here as well.
So I want to just ask, do you help file for the visas, or is it, so you have a...
Yeah, we have a pretty large mobility team.
Okay.
About 23% of our business, actually every worksite employee has a visa. So 23% of everyone that we bring on as a worksite employee, we're actually sponsoring visas for.
Okay, that's because I was going to bring that up. Is H-1B, like I just know it's a lottery system. So you submit it, and there's like at least for trying to find somebody from Germany coming here, it's like a 25% chance of winning it.
Yes, but there are some exemptions with nonprofits that go through that process. So a lot of nonprofits are not tied to the 50,000 lottery. They actually can expand from that, and actually gives them a larger opportunity to get individuals into the country. Again, depends on the nonprofit, depends on what you're looking at, but we would have to look at it on a case-by-case basis and support that process.
I just came up with I just thought of something. I'm not going to bring it up here.
We'll talk about that afterwards.
I got a brainstorm idea. So we've got like 4 minutes left.
Yeah, I know. Any others?
No.
Okay.
But I was thinking, John, before I had one more question.
Oh, yeah,
I think I'm going to just ask everybody just to kind of go, starting with Amy here, just what did you get? One tidbit. Just throw out like a tidbit that maybe just one more voice of an idea or something that maybe the viewers would want to know about, or some tidbit.
Well, I think they may have heard this from us talking, is that advanced planning. I can't stress that enough, because, and I stress it now still again and again and again, because so many clients come to us asking for help. They've already started the chain go, the ball is rolling already, and we're like, let's pull it back a little bit. So, and you addressed a lot of these at the beginning of this, is the who, the why, the where, the when, the what, and the how.
Yeah.
And think about those 6 questions you should be asking yourself. And really, I mean, that's very important. You think about those 6 things before, and then talk to people like us. You're well ahead of the game.
Do you have something?
Yeah, I would say it's exactly what you're saying. Just adding to it is, there's never a stupid question.
That's good. Hey, I used to hear that when I was in grammar school.
Yeah, well, it still applies. Ask 100 questions, and make sure you really understand what you're getting yourself into. There's a reason why global expansion is complex, but there is a way to do it a lot more simplistically. But the question is, why? What are we looking to accomplish here? Ask the right questions, ask the right people, not just look, we all live on the internet, this is the age we live in, but whatever you research on the internet, back it up with an expert. I think that's going to be really important. So take the chance to be proactive, take a step back, and make sure you're doing it the right way.
Can I add one more thing to that, though? We work with a lot of startups, and we are very understanding of the cost pressures when people are expanding abroad. So don't let cost interfere with doing something you really want to do. because you will partner up and can partner up with people that will help you along the way, and you grow together.
And that cost that you may see today, that penalty, may be a lot higher.
Yeah.
So think about that.
So John, I think
Nothing else earth-shocking other than the fact that I would just emphasize what Rick and Amy were saying, and just give an example with a recent client they were setting up a new for-profit entity, and they've done it the right way. They got their legal involved up front. They have us involved in how to set it up. They were able to go through the transaction, and everybody knew how it was going to perform. And so come audit and tax time, it was smooth sailing. It was smooth sailing, but that's probably 5% of the time. So that's the bad news.
We can always look at that perfection there, John.
That's the bad news.
I think that time is up. Did you want to close this up here?
Yeah, it's been a pleasure talking with everybody today. Thanks again to our panelists, our esteemed moderator, and we look forward to what I'll just end up saying today is please fill out the evaluation forms, and if there's future topics you want us to talk about, we always, as we have these quarterly meetings, we put them together. We may do some in-person sessions. We've done that a lot over the years. This is the first webinar we've done, so be curious to get feedback on how you like the webinar as well. And otherwise, we wish everybody a good week. I can't believe it's December, and happy holiday season to everybody. And thanks again, everyone. It was a pleasure today.
Happy holidays, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Bye-bye.